Hi, Hunter Hastings here. I believe that business management, as we understand it today and as it's taught in business school traditionally, is a thing of the past, a relic of the industrial age. We'll find it was a decades long era, just like Keynesian economics. Self organization, supported by digital enablement, is the new way that businesses will run. I'll post an article on the Value Creators website that explains the idea. But hold on. Not every business reformer thinks that way. Maybe we just suffered from lousy managers, and there are better software-enabled methods and environments in which management can be enacted without the horrors that we've experienced in the past. Today we're talking to Projjal Ghatak. He's the founder of Onloop, a software platform for collaborative team development. In this environment, teams are the unit of organization rather than hierarchies and structures and divisions and compliance bureaucracies. Individuals on teams are energized and engaged to focus on value creation. There's still management, but as we'll find out, the management role is different from the traditional one of boss. Proijal is one of those great entrepreneurs who designed a solution because he lived through the problem. He's a Stanford MBA grad. Before starting Onloop in 2020, he held business leadership roles across technology with Uber, management consulting with Accenture, and corporate development at SR Capital. He came out of that experience with a mission to convert every manager in the world to a great manager. Software can do that. He's been building Gen AI native tech since 2021 by a proprietary collaborative team development approach that's a platform not to replace management, but to revolutionize management and leadership as we know it.
This is the Value Creators Podcast. Value creation is the sole purpose of any business and every business, and for all of us as entrepreneurs. Listen to great value creators as they share their successes, trials, and lessons learned. Join us as we explore how to think as value creators, how to act as value creators, and how to view business through the lens of value creation.
Proijal, welcome to the Value Creators Podcast.
Thank you, Hunter. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's very exciting. You're going to tell us about what you're doing at Onloop and more importantly, how you're thinking about the future of teams and management and how to run businesses. So we're finding that business organization is changing at very high speed. The old concepts of management, I like to say, came from the industrial age. They were standard in the 20th century, but they're running out of steam in the 21st century. And one of the influences for that is software, the capability for coordination and collaboration across the globe, across networks. And I like to say that managers are not needed in that context, although we might debate that a little bit. But at minimum, their role becomes changed significantly. So you started a company called Onloop. It's at the cutting edge of this market trend. We're going to talk about that. But I'd like you to talk, Projjal, at the beginning about what's the problem we're solving, because you identified it very clearly in what I've read from what you said, and you've experienced it. So let's start with a problem to solve.
Yeah, so the problem to solve is ultimately, I think every single business is focused on, if you have a set of resources, be it people or capital, how do you unlock its full potential, right? And the term management, and one of my gripes is that people use the term manager, leader, coach, sort of interchangeably, but they all have a very specific meaning. And leaders exist to inspire and inspire people towards a movement. Managers exist to take a sort of business imperative and break it down to a place that can be executed against. And coaches ask great questions to elicit self-reflection. And you know, the world's best executives are probably a combination of all three, but they serve different tasks. And frankly, if you go and interview every leader around the world, and which is why our tagline now has become, how do we turn every manager into a great manager? people have really struggled with this problem that as orgs scale, they believe that they need more and more managers, typically broken down in spans of control of between 4 to 8 people, and that's how orgs around the world are structured. And people have constantly complained that we don't have good managers. We have many first-time managers, and they don't know what to do. So it's a universal problem that has plagued every geography and every industry and every size of business.
Yeah, it does seem to be a universal problem. So then you framed a solution for that, Projjal. We'll get into the details of Onloop, the features, and so on in a second. But we always talk about how you get out of that mindset, the managerial mindset. We talk about new mental models. We talk about different ways to think. But you've used the mechanics of collaborative software to change people's mindsets, I think. So you're probably dismantling some hierarchy and some authority, but stay at the big picture. How are you thinking about how you change the world for that problem to be solved?
Yeah. So one of the issues that we saw is that everybody found this whole topic of leadership or management very sort of difficult to approach, and that's because it's sort of people have learned to believe that it's complex, it's hard to sort of dismantle, it's hard to rethink about the parts. And so we are a product company, and I think what good product companies do is really simplify complex problems. And one of the industries we took a lot of inspiration from is the fitness industry, and products that started first with the Fitbit. We started tracking how many steps you took, and how many steps you took as a very simple proxy of living a healthy life. And then the Apple Watch would introduce 3 rings to complete every day as a way to sort of manage your health. And now products like the Whoop Band or the Aura Ring, that codify your daily habits into some sort of a score, and then give you micro habits to get better. And so we took that same approach to breaking down the job of a manager. And actually, the job of a manager is not rocket science, right? So at the base of it, you've got to make sure your people are motivated, and we call that energy. Frankly, people aren't motivated. It doesn't matter how good or bad or skillful or not skillful they are, and motivation or energy levels sit at the foundation, of sort of productivity or performance. The second layer is, do they have clarity on their goals? And actually, this is where I think companies have utterly failed to drive clarity, typically at the individual or sub team level. I think businesses have got very good at describing their strategic goals at a unit level. So if it's a company or a business unit, but they typically do a poor job of having that trickle down through an organization. And we believe the part of the issue there is frameworks and approaches that we've used are just not effective in doing that. And then the third layer is sort of, are people getting enough feedback to both convert who they are into productive use, which we call superpowers, and then feel a sense that they're learning and growing, which is, are they identifying their blind spots? And then are they doing something about learning new skills, or sort of combating those blind spots? So ultimately, if a team is motivated, a team is clear and productive, and a team is learning and growing, that's a great team. And you can use technology to really investigate those layers in a structured way that can be done almost in a simplified mechanical manner, where it doesn't have to feel this woo-woo sophisticated, how good a communicator am I empathetic, etc., that so much of the management science goes on and on a lot about.
Yeah, we had Dr. Elias Abuja day on the podcast a couple of weeks ago. I see the Stanford football helmet on your credenza there. He's a Stanford professor of psychology, and he said that the way that leadership's taught in business school is totally manufactured and inauthentic.
Mm.
It's a psychological condition or artifact, not something that you can coach in 9 steps and things like that. So.
And actually, Stanford Business School, where I spent 2 years getting an MBA, sees itself largely as a school of self-awareness and self-discovery and really identifying who you are as a person. But that's leadership, right? So, and I really want to draw a distinction between leadership and management. And there are people who are fantastic leaders who may not be perfect managers. And actually, part of what inspired me to build Onloop was personal pain and the fact that I care a lot about my team, but I am not a particularly well organized person. And I never had the system and the tools to very specifically dismantle in a systematic manner what was going on for my team and how to help them be the best version of themselves on an everyday basis. And so our product and approach was born from personal pain of feeling an inadequate set of tools and approaches out in the market. And I started my career at Accenture Management Consulting. I'd spent 3.5 years at Uber. In between, I'd spent time at large sort of family offices. And so I feel like I got exposure to a lot of great institutions. But while the tools to communicate, while the tools to project manage, while the tools for other aspects of quote unquote doing work were getting better, we frankly sucked at products to help people quote unquote manage better. And that's how really the company was born.
Yeah, it's a great breakthrough because people don't normally think of products as addressing management problems, right? Products is something that you manage. So I love that you took your own experience and then designed a better experience. We always preach that, be your own customer, be your own consumer. And that's because that means you have a real passion and a real empathy for it. So you started building the features of Onloop. Tell us how you approached that. Get into the details of features. I've got this image in my head, Projjal, of the Apple Watch for management.
Yeah. No, and so I think when we first started out, so I left Uber in September of 2019. And actually within weeks of leaving Uber, I wrote a 2-pager, very simple Word doc that I titled Talent Technology. And talent technology differentiated from HR technology. Mm-hmm. And where technology serves the needs of the talent of the organization, not the HR management of it. And one of the very first use cases that I had found universally painful and largely ineffective was performance management, right? And the notion of going through these cycles of performance management, be it 3 months, 6 months, or 12 months, where every person in the company sat and wrote essays about each other for 2 weeks, largely from memory. All work stops, and all people do is write goddamn essays. And then leaders walk into a calibration room, fight with each other, and largely make decisions based on memory. And it's the most bizarre, ineffective process in the world. I've never seen something be as time consuming and as useless at the same time. Right? and the stronger sort of side effect is that people therefore hated feedback.
Yeah.
Because they associated feedback and goals and clarity with performance management. So it's like if you have an obese population and you're trying to get people to lose weight, but the only gym you put in town has mold in it and stinks, no one's going to work out, right? Like it's like you're not going to have a healthy population. And the notion of writing performance reviews just felt like this backward process. So our first iteration was, can we make it easier for people to capture micro feedback? And that remains a cornerstone of our approach in terms of reducing the friction around regular feedback. Now we can use AI to just take people's unstructured observations and create feedback, because we don't think humans are actually wired to structure feedback in the right ways. They make observations of people and that's what they have. And technology is at a place now where we don't think people should need to do feedback in a structured way. And then we started working with GPT-3 back in 2021 to take those individual pieces of feedback to synthesize them into a summary. And so we were the first company in the world back in 2021 to announce automated performance reviews, and the fact that no one should be writing reviews. Actually, I have a T-shirt where I was in San Francisco recently, and people took pictures of it at the airport, which says, "You weren't born to write performance reviews." And at some point, I'd love to buy a billboard on the 101 which says that. But we quickly realized that performance reviews was a once in 6 months pain, and actually not directly day-to-day business impactful in driving productivity. And we were quite focused on feedback, but I was saying before, goals and motivation are more foundational to feedback. And that's how the bottom two layers of our CDD framework was born. And then sort of skills development and ongoing learning, very much tailored to you based on your goals and feedback, sort of rounded our framework. And then we sort of build the platform out around that core stack over the course of 2022, and really started monetizing the product in 2023. And in fact, today we see energy and goals make up 80% of engagement on the platform, because businesses really understood that if your people are motivated and are clear, they'll probably achieve outcomes. And understanding that fairly granularly, both individually, because our energy check-in in the app is a self-reflection. It's not someone else making the choice, but you yourself gauging where your battery level is a huge input to understanding sort of how you yourself will perform on a particular day. And then asking yourself, am I super clear on what targets, projects, and skills I need to execute against to move the business forward? And so the product, the way we solve the problem with companies is a combination of the framework and then a multi-platform product that was born mobile native, because we knew that building habits was very important, and there's no habit forming product that's not fundamentally until now a mobile app. I think that will change with conversational AI, and I think a lot of interfaces will become more conversational versus app based, but that's a whole different podcast on its own. And making it very easy to form habits that matter. And then for us as a product company, being very focused on usage and engagement. And, when I was at Uber and managed certain geographies, I looked at daily trips happening on the platform. We do a weekly usage review where we go deep into understanding aspects of product usage and what's working well and what's not. And unfortunately, many enterprise software companies have given two shits about how good a product is to use. They've amassed great sales teams that go and sell products, and then nobody cares whether they get used or not. And good product companies obsess about usage. And so, it's not rocket science, but we've taken approaches from a few different places that we've seen work, and sort of adopted it towards sort of people management, because we felt that people management was largely underserved by products that were built for HR management. And I couldn't sort of double click more on the distinguished nature of HR management versus people management. But I would say 95% of the world still use those two concepts synonymously. And I think that's an issue too.
Yeah, one of our podcast guests one time was from Mercer, the HR consulting company, said the original design of HR was to keep the lid on the boiling pot.
Yes.
Suppress.
It's a compliance function. And so is IT, right? And today, you go tell any software engineer, oh, do you work in IT? And he's going to be insulted, right? But 20 years ago, we called everything IT. But now we realize engineering and design are these innovative functions versus IT is an infrastructural risk management function. And the same about managing people and HR. And managing people and HR are very different things, but the world today synonymizes the two. And as a result, I think that sits at the core of why approaches that we've built in the past have been largely ineffective.
So I'd like to go there, and you you talk about teams as a core unit, and you talk about hybrid teams,
Mm.
Projjal, and you can think of hybrid two ways. One, the remote and on-site, and then all the geographical distribution. So I've got teams scattered all over the world, but also across functions. So
Yeah.
a marketing team might have a finance representative and a product representative, and as well as a marketing expert. So tell us how you think about hybrid teams and how your software kind of integrates across those hybrid boundaries or
Yeah.
eliminates the hybrid boundaries, I guess.
Yeah. So, and usually, people will use hybrid to mean the former, but I really like the notion of distributed as well, right? So at Uber, I was on Zoom most of the time, right? I was sitting in an office setting, but I was on Zoom calls with people around the world. This is pre-pandemic. Now, post-pandemic, people spend more time in home offices versus conference rooms in offices doing similar things. So tech companies, I think, have been working in a hybrid fashion for a long time. I
Mhm.
think a lot of more traditional businesses have had to adopt different approaches of distributed remote work, remote flexible distributed, whatever you want to call it, through the pandemic. I think the second definition, actually, one of my past advisors used to call it a full brain team. So he talks about units of people that are full brain, that have people from all functions. I think the biggest thing that becomes important when you put people across different backgrounds together, or people working across different boundaries, is to be much more intentional. So when you have five people who all look and feel alike, have the same context, same experience in the same room, you don't have to be intentional about how do we get the best out of this team, because
Mhm.
that is often in the underlying DNA and it's sort of assumed. And when you have teams that become more complex through the two definitions you brought out, there just needs to be greater intentionality in how you build the cadences and the rhythms in those organizations. And more recent, and that's why agile sort of popularized the notion of a stand up as a core ritual that sits within
Mhm.
it, that sort of gives everybody an intentional, structured voice to make sure that things move forward the right way. There's a lot of controversy around one-on-ones, and how often you should do them. Are they good or not? Jensen Huang, who's the CEO of NVIDIA, recently came on a conference that Stripe was holding, saying he doesn't do one-on-ones and doesn't believe in one-on-ones.
Mhm.
And again, that's another podcast on its own. But one-on-ones become an interesting ritual as well for a manager to really break down what's going on for a team member. And a lot of our customers use our CDD framework across energy, goals, feedback, and skills to sort of run more structured one-on-one conversations, to just bring more intentionality, and bring more structure to sort of environments that need that structure, because now they're working across different boundaries of various sorts, versus five homogeneous people sitting in one room all day long. And in those environments, you don't have to add more structure because the meat will come out anyway. But when you remove those conditions, you just need to get more intentional.
So drill down on that for me, Projal, just to help us all understand intentionality. Because where we come from, intent can be a source of lack of clarity.
Mm,
If I'm an entrepreneur, we call it entrepreneurial intent. I don't have a plan, I don't have a goal, but I kind of want to get somewhere.
mm.
But your intent might not be my intent, or your intent understanding might not be my understanding. So just go a little bit further on intentionality, because you use the word structure, and that sounds like it's specific. We'll do this, we'll do this, we'll do this.
Yeah, and so so when you think about things like clarity and clarity around goals and feedback, The reason why the problem we're solving remained largely unsolved pre-pandemic. And pre-pandemic is a world in which people are spending most of their time in an office and can quickly have a quick conversation about something that's going off track or a quick piece of feedback. That sort of informal feedback loop sort of disappeared overnight, right? Um, and and a lot of leaders want people back in the office because they're anxious that as to whether people are doing work or not. It's more to manage their anxiety to sort of feel that people are doing work. And then B, they're usually older and they've grown up in an in-office setting and they've got used to the tap on the shoulder to have a quick 5-minute discussion versus intentionally setting up a Zoom conversation or a Slack conversation to do it. And then they feel like they're being ineffective as leaders or managers because they're not able to adapt to the new normal. And so what I mean by intentionality is sort of being very clear around each aspect of work and adding rituals and cadences that drive that clarity consistently. So in our company, we have a weekly all hands, and we've had now a weekly all hands for close to 4 years. And the people who come from corporates who are like, "Oh my God, like y'all meet weekly? Like we have town halls once a quarter, right?" And that felt enough. Like, why do you all have to bring the company together every week? And I'm that's because how else do we build relationship and rapport and camaraderie? And I started judging our weekly all hands by how much people laughed. Like that was a core variable for me to understand the success of that meeting and understand whether we were doing our core objective of bringing the team closer together. And if I don't do that intentionally, it's not going to happen, right? And we have to create time in the calendar for things that matter. And I'm a huge believer of calendaring everything. My calendar has sleep calendared, has time with my wife calendared, has working out calendared, has everything calendared. And that's an example of being intentional, because if you're not structuring and calendaring it, it's not going to happen. And that's just more important in the digital hybrid world we live in. Does that answer the question, Hunter?
Yeah, it does. That's really, really helpful. Thank you. When you talk about how much laughter there was in the meeting, that's feedback, right? That's a feedback loop.
Totally, 100%. And you know, and the word meeting also gets bastardized a lot, right? Like, and there's a lot of hate for meetings. But like, when you go for date night with your wife, like that's a meeting too.
Yeah.
Right. But that's a meeting. People don't like shit on.
Don't call it a meeting.
Correct. But like any time more than one human being is coming together in any interaction is a meeting. Right. And so people are like, we need fewer meetings. I'm like, well, like it's humanity. We meet. Like we meet and converse. That's what we do. But we just have to be more clear why we're meeting. And that may not be to do anything productive. It might be just to have fun. And that's okay, right?
Yep.
And that's not a problem.
We're delighted to announce the Value Creators online course. For entrepreneurs in every kind of business, big, small, or medium, at every stage, in every industry, our course provides the foundations and principles on which to build success. Simple, clear purpose and principles give rise to creativity, innovation, and competitively superior business action. There are 11 foundational principles or mental models that together cohere into the value business model. Principles for value generation, principles for value operations, principles for value finance and accounting, and principles for value sustainability, as well as the new knowledge accumulation you'll need for continuous innovation. These principles are delivered by top business professors from top business schools: Mark Packard, Per Byland, Gordon Miller, David Rapp, and Bart Vanderhagen. You'll find video lessons from them, along with downloadable tools, processes, and other valuable content. Master these lessons, and you'll master the most important skill in business, value creation. Go to thevaluecreators.com and click the course link. So the new performance management, Projjal, you established that we all hate the old performance management, but we still need that. Is it all qualitative? Is it laughter and ChatGPT figuring out whether people are motivated through the feedback loop, or what is performance management under your new way of thinking?
Yeah. So listen, I like a lot of how I think about the world is influenced quite by Uber and me spending sort of close to 4 years at that company. But essentially, what Uber was able to do was build a better taxi, right? And but the only way you could build a better taxi was by fighting against status quo, and that's why Uber invented ride-hailing as an alternative to taxi, with the same core objective of getting people from point A to point B. And so for us, collaborative team development is a new way to help people do feedback and goals in an organization and replace old school ways of doing it, which is called performance management. And the way we see performance management is a system of record, right? It's a form filling exercise that is happening at a certain cadence in an organization for the primary purposes of documentation and compliance. That's the root of where the practice exists. And as a result, the sort of frustrations around form filling bureaucracy are sort of integral to the process. What we've said is, instead of building systems of record, let's build systems of action. And systems of action are regularity of observations and conversations. And then let's use technology to form the system of record. So in our product suite, we replaced manual performance reviews with something that we call Prism summaries. And Prism summaries can self-cluster, so we can cluster people's feedback into areas that are dynamically decided, or in certain organizations, if they have certain values or competencies, we can look at those set of unstructured observations and sort of look at how much of those values or competencies are demonstrated in those observations, and then also score them based on the observations that we see. But what we do is that we change the human attention to driving a system of action and use machines to create the system of record, versus pulling the human being to creating systems of record that are bureaucratic, time-consuming, and ineffective, right? So you get to the same outcome, but in a less biased manner, in a less painful manner, and in our opinion, a more effective manner, because you now taken away sort of every manager rating a team member on a scale of 1 to 5. And the worst thing about a rating system is when 5 different people with 5 different definitions of things are rating 5 other people with different definitions of things, and they try to compare them.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I coined a term called eloquence bias, whereby whoever sounds good is assumed to be good. Right? And organize, and there's a lot of talk about DEI and gender parity and how do we drive more sort of equal outcomes at work. It all boils down that the straight, white, extroverted male, typically American, says what they think and are loud about it. And in the workplace environment today, that is rewarded. The reason why we have so many Dicks and Johns and Bobs as CEOs and not enough women is because they have more audacity. And from the time they're children, they're told to speak their mind and state their views and command the room. Versus minorities, introverts, women are told, be careful what you say so you don't get bullied. Right? And that sits at the basis of how work is structured today. And so if we can get people focused on work and focused on observations about that work and we let machines make decisions on whether Bob is more productive than Jill versus Bob's manager John being in a screaming match in a calibration room, I think we'll get fairer outcomes.
So, what about motivation, Projjal? We've talked about that. It's really important. But it's not something you can measure in a performance way. Can AI figure out if someone's motivated based on their behavior or based on their uh, the dialogue that they're entering, or how do you detect motivation?
Great
How do
question.
you skill that?
So today we have not AI'd the motivational input yet, right? So that's a self-reported battery level that you feel, right? Does your battery feel full? Does your battery feel empty? Or are you somewhere in between? That is self-reported, visible only to the manager, because if you make it visible to everybody, it kills psychological safety around that input, and people stop doing it. And over time, we're thinking about how do you get that input on a more 360 basis? Because I think when someone's feeling burnt out or down, others can often experience that more intuitively than even individuals themselves sometimes. And then B, can you use people's observations to infer energy level? And I think that you can infer most things from observations. And actually, the ability of AI to understand a specific human emotion from tonality or approach is still not quite there yet. People have tried to believe that it is for a few years, but I don't think it is. AI is much better at structuring, synthesizing, deciphering sort of the quality of the content versus the tonality of the content in our experience. But I think technology will get better around it. But one of the issues I've had is that the general HR world has looked at well-being or wellness or perks as a different arm versus performance, right? So sort of things to motivate employees or engage employees are seen as a different part of a horizontal stack. But actually, what again I've realized through experience that motivation sits at the base of productivity, and motivation can be affected by different things. So personally, for me, I've now been diagnosed as a clinical anxiety patient, and as I made the founder journey, I went through certain phases that my anxiety got so bad that I was just unable to perform, right? And that was shocking to me as someone who like has viewed himself as a high performer for a very long time. And once that short circuits in your system, nothing on top of that, like how clear your goals are or how
Yeah.
good you are, like all of that becomes like completely irrelevant. And so for us, sort of a big shift is how do we put it as a part of the stack for performance versus another nice to have. And that's why I think the language you use around things is important. We use the word wellness in the beginning around sort of how people are feeling, but we realize that the word wellness has a very soft connotation. And a lot of leaders are sort of wellness averse, right? Like when you say wellness to most hard charging founders are like, what the fuck are you talking about, right? Like it's an irrelevant concept. But as soon as we started looking at it as an energy level or as motivation, I think it just clicks for people better. And we've been blown away by how often people are doing these energy checks in the product, and it has exceeded our expectations on the engagement around it, and so definitely resonates for folks.
Yeah. One of the areas that we experiment with is what we call things that matter. So
Yeah,
you ask people what are the things that matter to them personally in this project, in this team,
yeah.
in dealing with Sally or Joe, and they can always answer that.
Mm,
And
mm,
you can do the same kind of thing that you're talking about. You can cluster those kinds of responses. You can start to scale them. You can start to put them on a matrix of some kind. So we don't ask motivational question. We ask What are the things that matter? So that's what we're experimenting with.
Yeah, my definition of that is defining a purpose portfolio.
Mm-hmm.
Once people have a defined purpose portfolio, everything in their lives very neatly starts fitting into those sets of purpose portfolios or not, right? Because my therapist keeps telling me to get a hobby, and I think hobbies are dumb. And so I'm like, I don't need hobbies. But when I started thinking about it as purpose portfolios, and that my purpose portfolio has my family,
Yeah.
Onloop and our mission, and the country of Singapore as like specific purpose pillars, I can then think about a diversity of activities that serve those purpose pillars. And I think one of the biggest differences we will see with humanity in the next few decades is a deeper focus on purpose. Because I think what AI will do is that it will force us to really investigate and isolate what makes us deeply human. Because that is the only thing that will be left for us to double down on. Because everything cognitively will be done by machines, and the average human's ability to beat out a machine on most types of cognitive knowledge work will be incredibly poor. But I think this notion that humans exist to serve, and once they put themselves in a service orientation, better things happen,
Yeah.
I think is still very not understood at the mass level globally. And how do we get people constantly in service orientation at all levels of privilege, right? Like you can be in service orientation incredibly poor or incredibly wealthy. And I think every great leader will tell you that magic happens when you're in service orientation.
Yeah, and we talk about that as the definition of entrepreneurship. It's serving others, identifying their needs and finding solutions for them. It's a service orientation. So I like that. Incidentally, there's a new book by Nick Bostrom called Deep Utopia.
Mm,
And you may want to look at that because it's
I will.
about how if AI does everything for us, how do we find purpose?
Yeah,
And
and listen, I don't think this problem is new, right? And there wasn't social media at the time when machines were born and the industrial revolution happened. But I'm sure the vast majority of manual laborers were worrying about the same problem with the industrial revolution, right?
right, right.
I don't think this movement is necessarily different from history. I think it is different in scale, and today the vast majority of quote unquote smart people are in cognitive knowledge worker jobs.
Mhm.
I think that's going to go through a seismic upheaval. um, and I don't think people have quite internalized how big that change is, and how that changes the global order in terms of how we think about globalization, how we think about where talent is. And the one technology that is still not yet hit mainstream, that will be sort of the third turbine to the turbulent chain. So the first turbine is distributed hybrid work, the second is generative AI, and the third is what I call immersive virtual reality. So once you and I can have this conversation with lifelike avatars, not cartoonish avatars, in
Mhm.
an immersive manner where it feels like we're in the same studio, we will unlock a whole different level of global productivity. And countries like the Philippines that today export a lot of non-technical cognitive work, using those technologies well is poised for incredible growth. And I think the Philippines does that well. This is their China moment in terms of sort of becoming the place that exports cognitive jobs globally with immersive VR and Gen AI. And so I think developed countries have to really rethink what the nature of their workforce looks like, and how do they support a population that will be considered expensive as well as non-competitive, in a world that is powered by Gen AI and immersive VR.
Well, let me drag you back to the present, Projjal, and let's talk about organization and firm structure. So in firms and corporations, we'd love to think that you can get rid of hierarchy, you can get rid of silos and divisions, you can create a network, distributed, flat organization, and so on. Um, is that real? Are we going to be able to do that? Are you making progress in that direction?
I mean, it's a company called Hire, Haier,
Yeah, we know that. Yeah.
and they've been very famous about holocracies,
Mhm.
and how to build structures differently. Um, in my experience, I don't think that scales very well, or is difficult to really execute, because I think as human beings, we're also hardwired to follow someone else's direction, right? Like I don't think self-direction, and this comes from humanity, right? You grow up as a child with a parent, right? And you look to your parent to decide what to do, right? For a very large amount of time. At some point, you grow rebellious, and you're like, no, I don't want to listen to my parents. But that innate nature to follow someone else exists. And that's why I think vast majority of organizations still follow a hierarchical organizational structure, because every human being needs one person to go to and say, hey, how do I prioritize this, or what do I do about the situation? Now, there's a company called Bain, right, which is a consulting company,
Mhm.
and they've done the vast majority of tech reorgs in the last decade or so, um, largely based on two core sort of assets of theirs. One is a framework called Rapid, um, where R stands for responsible, A stands for accountable, P stands for perform, I stands for informed, and D informs for decision maker, right? So they talk about how if every project, if there's a strong rapid framework around it, then organizational structures start mattering less, right? So,
Mhm.
so that's a core asset. And then the second is the notion of spans of control, and that every people manager in an org should have between 4 to 8 direct reports. And what happens in tech companies as they grow is that you often have nodes of people where one person's managing one person, another person managing two people, but then in a weird part of the org, someone's managing 8 people. But what they typically do is reorg the company to standardize spans of control and then increase spans of control. But this notion to 4 to 8 exists because in your original sort of context setting too, the work of a manager is seen as manual and quite overbearing. I think what becomes very cool with AI, and we are having discussions internally of what percentage of human managers should be human managers and how many of them can be replaced by AI, is that you can start increasing spans of control significantly. So your best managers can start managing now 16 or 20 people, with 80% of the typical manager's job being done by an AI copilot. And the manager then only having to deal with the 10 or 20% that are very hard to solve through technology. Right. So maybe deep issues around motivation, right? And maybe one example where that has to be humanly solved. But to assess someone's motivation and provide suggestions on how to change that motivation on a simple basis may not be a human need anymore. That can be done by machines. That can then start changing how we think about sort of structures and how many layers exist and how flat organizations get. Um, but ultimately, people want one boss, right? And so no matter how much you matrix an organization, you will have a direct manager and then a bunch of maybe indirect managers. And then B, most people can only handle 4 to 8 direct reports at one time at the moment. And actually, very high performing companies, and I consider Meta one of them, their managers don't do IC work. Their managers are mostly managers, and they're
Mhm.
spending 80% of the time effectively managing and 20% of the time doing IC work. The problem in most organizations is that people managers also have a full person's IC workload. And IC stands for individual contributor. And
Yeah.
so then your job as a manager is always second fiddle to your job as an individual contributor. And therein lies a problem too. And the last point I'll say that, and I spent about a month in Silicon Valley a few weeks ago, and I at least had 4 builder engineer type people who said, I never want employees. I never want to manage people. I never want to build an org. And which is why I believe Silicon Valley has not solved this problem we're solving. Because Silicon Valley is largely made up of individual builders, engineers or designers solving problems for other individual builders. And there is sort of a allergy to actually managing organizations. And I think the reason why I find this problem fascinating is because I think we sit at this very unique cusp in time where I think we can scale organizations and scale management without having to burden people in quite the same way. And I think that is powerful.
Yeah, so I love that vision, Projjal. Permit me to challenge the word control and span of control, because that sounds like the legacy, right? That sounds like what we're trying to solve for. We don't want control. And report. We don't want to report to our boss, right? We want to collaborate and interact and those kinds of things. So can we at least change the language?
I mean, span of control is not my language; it's Bain's language, and most consulting firms' language. And these consulting firms are working with what would be considered leading tech companies in the world, right? The one thing I will push back on is, I think people do like being told what to do. They like being told what to do by someone they respect and someone they look up to. They don't like being told what to do by people they don't respect. And in my life, I've had both managers I've respected and managers I've not respected. And I've been a very different person based on whether I personally respect the person or not, right? And I think that we've lost the ability to think about things with nuance and critically think through it. So it's not binary that people don't want to be controlled or want to be controlled or don't want to be told what they want to do. There's a nuance around it of, do I respect the person on the other side? And that's what frustrates me about the discourse in the world today about any topic, is that it's way too bloody binary, right? And the same thing with reporting lines, right? Like, ultimately, businesses are not charities, right? They're hiring people to get a job done. They're getting paid to do it, right? And when you get paid to do something, you got to deliver, right? Like you can't, it's not play school, right? Like, and so I think that's the other thing that's important to realize, is that, yes, it's not an army where it's command and control, because we are in creative industries. And actually, if you were not in the creative or innovation industry, command and control is actually better. Where command and control does not work is when you expect people to innovate and be creative, and you need to insert play. But not every company has the profit margins of Google and Facebook, and therefore should not be run like Google and Facebook. And so when you print money, and your only way to grow is through innovation, you can afford a lot of play. But when you're a manufacturing unit with 2% margins, you better command and control, or you're going to run the business to the ground. And again, we don't think through the nuances of situations around what works in each one of them, versus saying A is B, A is good, B is bad, and it's binary. And that's incredibly frustrating for me. And I see very smart people adopt binary positions more and more without thinking through the nuance of it.
Yeah, one of the areas we're studying now is the right brain, left brain discussions, or we should say right hemisphere dominant, left hemisphere dominant. And that binary approach is left hemisphere dominant. And apparently the world is becoming more left hemisphere dominant. And the right approach is integrative, as you would say. It's using both.
The answer is always somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
And the book title that I've always thought about writing is a book called Nuance.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because everything in the world is nuanced. And we are rapidly eroding nuance in our discourse. And
Yeah.
and that is one of the, like, even I don't want to talk about political issues, but even the discourse around Israel Palestine and what I consider very smart people saying just blows my mind. Because there is an inability to think through things, and a desire to virtue signal, and a desire to clickbait things, and there are two problems that I talk a lot about that don't get talked about. One is the effect of content like Cocomelon on children, and how it frazzles people's brains even before they touch Instagram. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So, like, addictive YouTube content is the generational threat, not Instagram. And B, the erosion of critical thinking and nuance in our general population. And those are huge diseases that are not treated in hospitals and not discussed, because there's no lobby behind it putting up a bunch of money, because anything that's public discussion now is largely fueled by someone funding it.
Right.
and depends on who's funding what is then sort of decided as a big issue. I tell people, like, I feel really bad for Zelensky because everybody forgot about it, right? Like, as soon as Israel Palestine became a thing, there's no mention of Ukraine, right? And a year and a half ago, everybody was up in arms about Ukraine, but now people have forgotten because a new shiny object called Rafah in Palestine. Right. And so all the people who cared about Ukraine now don't care anymore. Right? Because they found something new and shiny. And so it's terrible. And the just the lack of critical thinking and first principles thinking in the world at the moment.
Well, let's leave it there on that big problem, Projjal. So onloop.com, is that the place for people to go and find out about your company?
Yeah, Onloop.com is the best place to find the company. I live on LinkedIn and not on Twitter. And so, but if you look for me or the company on LinkedIn, it's quite easy to reach me. And I love hearing from folks, whether you agree or disagree with me. I love hearing from you because that's the only way I learn. And I may not respond to everything, but I definitely read everything that comes through.
Good. Well, it's wonderful to meet you. I love what you're doing with Onloop, and I'm sure it's continuous improvement, and you're finding out more and more about how to solve these kinds of problems. I'd love to talk to you again, because I think another big question we didn't tackle is, are we restructuring the economy? Are we going to have lots of smaller but more collaborative, more connected kinds of firms in the world that you're designing? And I think that might be the case too. Maybe we can talk again about that.
I'll leave you with one stat I read yesterday. 66% of Gen Zs have a side hustle.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a large number. And that number shocked me. And so maybe that's the starting data point for that next discussion. But I and that's why we call it collaborative team development. And we think the unit of teams will continue, whether the unit of teams will sit in companies or different structures. That's why one of the things about Web3 that I was excited about was DAOs and decentralized autonomous orgs and what they could do. Unfortunately, all of these concepts got used more for gambling than for good. But in DAOs inherently there is a piece that I think is powerful, and I do think that we will find different ways to organize, but we will always work in teams and always sort of organize around certain movements.
Yeah, I think teams is right, but in complex evolving systems theory, self-organization is recognized. It works in biological environments. We're not quite sure whether it works in human environments yet, but we've got all the legacy that you talked about that we have to shed before we can get to the self-organizing part. So
yes.
Good.
But longer conversation.
Yeah, exactly. We'll do it. So Proijal, thank you very much. Onloop is your company, onloop.com, and Projjal Ghatak on LinkedIn.
Yeah, this was great. Thank you for indulging me, Hunter.
Thank you so much.
All right. Bye.
This has been another episode of the Value Creators Podcast. Thanks for listening. You can visit thevaluecreators.com for links and resources related to this episode, and check out hunterhastings.com for more content on entrepreneurial business management based on value creation principles.